All right, everybody, let's get started on Chapter 3, How is Speech Perceived? Sensation and perception. Perception is the first step in the process of perceiving speech, and it happens so quickly that it's unlikely that we realize it's happening. In this perception stage, sensation occurs when information or speech is registered by the ear, then sends this input information to the auditory nerve, and finally the information is processed by the brain. This happens extremely quickly, as stated. There are certain situations that people can become aware of their perception of speech, though. So when we hear something that's unfamiliar to us, or something that we don't recognize in a certain context, we can become consciously aware of our active perception of speech. Echoic and sensory memory. Echoic memory is memory for sounds that we hear, and it lasts anywhere from 3 to 4 seconds. And sensory memory is where most input is stored temporarily. It's stored in a representative way that helps us preserve the detail contained in the incoming stimulus. So in other words, echoic memory is the place where we briefly store sounds that we hear, and sensory memory is the place where we use the details from previous contexts to help us better understand, fill in the blanks, or predict something about the current incoming stimulus that we're experiencing. Perceiving speech. One way we can perceive speech so efficiently is by using pattern recognition. Pattern recognition requires that a listener is actively, although likely subconsciously, searching memories and comparing current speech to other forms of speech memorized throughout their lifetime. This relates back to when we do not understand something in the perception and sensation section. Perception and sensation section. I'm having a lot of trouble speaking today, apparently. We're able to understand speech visually as well, and one way we can do that is via spectrograms. A spectrogram plots passing time and energy of a sound wave in hertz on a graph. An example of a spectrogram is shown above. And an interesting fact about spectrograms is called a formant. And a formant describes the visual pattern of producing vowels on a spectrogram. In other words, vowels are more complex to pronounce, so the bands or lines go up and down more when people pronounce vowels than when they pronounce consonants. Humans can perceive anywhere from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. 20 hertz is low, like a bass drum, thunder, or a very deep tone of voice, and 20,000 hertz is like a shriek from a child or a whistle. Problems perceiving speech. Spectrograms can be tricky to read. As I'm sure you noticed in the last slide, spectrograms are pretty difficult to read. One reason that they are difficult to read is that it's relatively difficult to determine where one word stops and another word begins. Additionally, it can be difficult to ascertain which words are given more emphasis and which words are given less. We can simply read that some do and some do not have more stress or emphasis on them, but we don't know which ones are which. The problem of invariance is the fact that no two sound waves produced by human beings are ever the exact same. So even though people may say the same words over and over again throughout their lifetimes, they will never say these words the same way twice. Many factors have an effect on the sound waves of a spoken word. A few examples of this are the weather, so if it's hot or cold, the health of the speaker, are they sick or healthy, the age of the speaker, so pre-puberty versus post-pubic ages, energy level of the speaker, is the speaker energized or fatigued, and preceding words. So for example, I have time versus we have time will produce different sounds for the word have based on the preceding words of I and we. And then co-articulation is producing multiple phonemes simultaneously, and this occurs because of the physical properties of our mouths and the ways we shape them to produce speech. The textbook illustrates this fact in terms of b, boo, and ba. It's an interesting experiment to run on the mirror. You can see the differences, and hopefully you can watch yourself co-articulate at the same time. It's an interesting thing to actually see happen. Normalization. So normalization is one way around the problems of perceiving speech. So normalization is basically a phenomenon that boils down to the fact that human beings learn more about speech the more they hear speech. So, for example, I remember in my undergraduate tenure, I had a professor from Poland. She taught statistics, and her accent was really hard for me to understand for the first few weeks of the quarter. As I kept going to class every day, though, I continued to get better at understanding her, and by the end of the quarter, I rarely found myself not being able to understand her. So the more I exposed myself to her speaking, and I normalized it for myself. Artificial intelligence doesn't have this ability, so programs like Siri, Alexa, and Cortana don't have the ability to normalize speech, at least not yet. So this lack of adaptability is why people often get frustrated when using Siri or Alexa. It's because these programs do not understand us, and they can't learn how to understand us. So Siri and Alexa will likely make more mistakes when listening to you than the people who see you on a consistent basis, because the people who see you on a consistent basis are able to normalize your speech, whereas these programs are unable to do that. Age-related changes in hearing. As people get older, they have a harder time hearing. We've all experienced this with our grandparents, maybe even for some of you, your parents, coworkers, or family and friends who are older. And the technical term for this is presbycusis. While aging adults do have a harder time hearing, it's not just a general loss of hearing. In fact, losing hearing in terms of age-related hearing loss really only means that a person loses their ability to hear higher tones. So, for example, I have a deeper voice than my mom does, and when speaking to my father, who has age-related hearing loss, he's able to hear my voice and understand my voice more often than my mom's because the differences of our tones. So mine is deeper and my mom's is higher. What's interesting about this is that I tend to talk much more quietly than my mom does. So it's not the volume with which a person speaks, but rather the tone of their voice, the thing that they can't really control as much. Another example of this is ringtones. So you'll notice that people who have age-related hearing loss can't really hear high ringtones, like the ding on an iPhone. People with age-related hearing loss can't hear that as well. They can hear deeper tones, though. And then finally, the slip of the ear. Slips of the ear occur when older adults who have age-related hearing loss, they have difficulty distinguishing between certain consonants. So S and TH pronounces th. I don't even know if you could hear that, but the S and the TH sound are made, they're hard to distinguish for people with age-related hearing loss. The building blocks of speech. So as per your reading, you know that the English language is made up of 44 phonemes. Of those 44 phonemes, 25 are consonants that involve either partial or total stoppage of airflow. Consonants that involve a complete obstruction or airflow are called stop consonants. There are 15 vowels in the English language, and vowels are sounds produced without the interruption of airflow. Recall your readings from Chapter 2 and that all vowels in English are voiced, but only some consonants are. So these pairs of consonants that differ in the feature of voicing only are B, P, D, G, and K. And those letters are affected by voice onset time, which refers to the amount of silence between the beginning of the sound and when voicing begins. So the silence is called onset time, and what is perceived by listeners is to help them differentiate between consonants. The place of articulation refers to the place in which the vocal tract, or the place in the vocal tract where airflow is obstructed, either partially or fully. There are two kinds of places of articulation. So labials are phonemes where airflow is completely stopped at the lips. So an example of that would be a B or a P. And then there's dental, which is airflow is stopped at the teeth. So T or TH voiceless. And then there's another one. It's called a fricative. It's TH and TH voiceless cause only partial interruption of airflow, whereas T is a complete stop. And that one's sort of, it's not a specific place of articulation. It's just sort of a differentiation in between T and TH or between T, TH, and TH voiceless. And then lastly is the manner of articulation, is the extent to which airflow is stopped, and that is either partial or full. Syllables. Syllables are words that contain at least one vowel and one or more consonants and are produced with varying amounts of stress or accent in different parts of the word. So for example, in English, most words stress the first syllable. The English language, however, varies because so many words in English have been borrowed from other languages that the breakdown of a syllable is as follows. The onset, which is the beginning of the syllable, and the rhyme, which is the remainder of the syllable. Prosody is the pattern of stress and the rhythm of speech. So in English, one of the most recognizable patterns of prosody occurs in statements versus questions. When making a statement, the pattern of pitch drops as the sentence continues on, and when asking a question, the pitch of a statement gets higher as the sentence goes on. One interesting thing to talk about here is uptalk. Uptalk is a phenomenon wherein a person speaks a declarative sentence in such a way that it mimics asking a question. This often happens inadvertently and has been studied quite a bit regionally in the US. So listening to somebody with prosodic changes, variation in their dialect, is much more pleasurable to listen to than somebody who speaks in a monotone, which is really just sort of a fun fact that I thought I would throw in there. Models of attention and speech perception. So the first is selective attention, listening and ignoring. This model describes the ability to focus our attention on one stream of input among many other streams of input. So for example, imagine you're in a classroom, which I know is hard to imagine right now because a lot of us haven't sat in a classroom for almost a year now. But try anyway. So you're in a classroom and everybody around you is talking about literally anything other than class. Your professor just keeps on lecturing though. So according to selective attention, you're still likely to be able to understand and hear what the professor is saying since you have selective attention and the ability to listen to one stream of input, i.e. your professor, and not other streams of input, i.e. your peers. Studies of attention during listening related to selective attention are the dichotic listening task. So in the 1980s, a dichotic listening task was performed wherein participants wore a pair of headphones and in each ear a different tone played. So one tone in the left ear and one tone in the right ear. And they played simultaneously. Participants were asked to only pay attention to one stream of input and ignore the other. After this, participants were asked if they could remember anything from the stream of input that they had ignored. It turns out that no information was processed at all. This research finding helped uphold and support the idea of selective attention. Over time, however, these results have been more mixed than this particular research study suggests. So some studies suggest that unattended speech is completely ignored, while other studies suggest that some unattended speech is partially heard and attended to. So really it depends on which research you read or who you talk to. And then we have the cocktail party effect, which is ignoring streams of input around us while we're still processing them. So the cocktail party effect occurs when we're ignoring streams of input around us, however, we're still processing them. So this means that if we hear and process something that is relevant or important to us in a crowded, noisy room, we can quickly bring it to our attention. So if you think about a time where you were at a party or some kind of gathering and you just were kind of zoned out or listening to someone's story and out of nowhere you just heard someone say your name, that would be an example of the cocktail party effect. So the cocktail party effect sort of disproves selective attention, but the dichotic listening task sort of proves selective attention. So again, it really sort of depends on who you ask and what research you're reading, whether or not selective attention is truly effective or not. The motor theory. So Liberman and his co-researchers theorized that speech perception is related to speech production so closely that speech perception involves using speech input to identify physical movements made by the vocal tract to produce sound. that sounds really technical, because it is. But in essence, a listener can recreate a sound even when they cannot see the person who is creating the original sound. Something related to this is categorical perception, which is the ability to distinguish and organize categories of sounds together. So basically, grouping similar sounds together is categorical perception. This is not unique to humans, but humans do exhibit perceptual ability due to exposure of different sounds, which is different than other animals. So humans can look at something and identify the different sound that it's making than another object. Other animals can simply ascertain that two things are making different noises and categorize them separately, but they can't determine what's making the noises, if that makes sense. Motor theory continued. So this theory did hypothesize that a listener can learn how to reproduce a sound by seeing the lips and or gestures of the speaker. This is an example of listeners learning from the physical movements or gestures of a speaker. One obvious example of this would be lip reading for people with hearing impairments. Have led to great insights in the subfield of psychology of language or psycholinguistics. One such discovery is that physical gestures, i.e. lip movements, facial expressions, and hand movements, have a profound effect on understanding what a speaker is saying to a listener. So if you're listening to a person and you can't see their face, like if they're wearing a mask, it's harder to determine the sort of the message they're trying to convey, just because you can't read their facial cues. Mirror neurons are a part of this research as well. So mirror neurons, neuroscientists discovered that neurons fire anytime an action is performed by an organism or when an organism performs the action itself. So a modern example of this is watching people play video games. So a lot of people wonder why e-gaming or watching other people play video games has gained so much popularity over the last couple of years. And one possible explanation is mirror neurons. So essentially the same neuron fires when watching somebody play video games as when you're playing the video game yourself. So those who can't afford, or for those who aren't very good at video games, they may find pleasure and or benefit from watching someone else play video games if that person's really good at video games, because the same neurons that fire when you're playing the video game fire when you're watching someone else play the video game. So basically, if you get pleasure from being good at a video game, but you unfortunately suck at video games, watching someone who's really good at video games will give you that same pleasure in your brain. And this example exemplifies the neural connection between visual perception, movement, and speech. Morton's logogen model. So the logogen model is based on the Greek words logos, which means word, and genus, which means birth. So the logogen model is thought of as a morpheme or visual representation of a word in our minds, stored in our memory. So the logogen contains the word, meaning, sound, and spelling. And the triggers involved in the logogen model can be visual, so i.e. when we're reading, or auditory, i.e. when we're listening to another speaker. Right now you're doing both, which is interesting. The cohort model, the most influential model of speech perception to date. The word cohort simply means group. So in this model, it is hypothesized that listeners recognize within 200 milliseconds of a word being spoken the category the word belongs in. So in this way, listeners activate memories that recall phonemes and syllables similar to the incoming input and recognize them as compared to other categories. That being said, there are the uniqueness point and the recognition point in the cohort model. So as words continue, and this obviously happens much more quickly than I'm explaining it, But as words continue, the word reaches a uniqueness point wherein the process of determining the word reaches one possible outcome. Sometimes the uniqueness point is reached early in speech and is easy to predict, and other times recognition is not reached until the full word has been uttered, and speech is not recognized until after it is perceived completely by the listener. When this is the case, the uniqueness point is instead referred to as the recognition point. So you can either recognize a word via the uniqueness point based on past memory, and you can predict that word. But other times you might have no idea what's going to be said by the speaker because you've never heard it or you don't remember it or whatever. And then you don't really process what they say until after they've said it. And at that point, it's called the recognition point. In relation to these is the gating paradigm. So the gating paradigm suggests that speech or a word can be recognized before the complete utterance has been made. This paradigm is based on research from the 1970s and is consistent with those phenomena mentioned above, i.e. the uniqueness point and the recognition point. Also related to this is bottom-up and top-down processing. So bottom-up processing uses only information available in the stimulus. So basically, bottom-up processing uses only the speech, vocal cues, and gestures associated with a person's speech, and nothing else. Using bottom-up processing does not fill in any blanks or add any information. It only uses the information given in speech. Top-down processing, on the other hand, goes beyond the information given in the stimulus to make a determination or judgment. So top-down processing uses all the things that bottom-up processing uses, but it also adds context, previous experience, and expectations to fill in gaps or add something that is otherwise missing from what is directly said by the speaker. And then the last model is the trace model, which is a computer program created in the mid-1980s to recognize individual words. The trace model is a complex system. However, it boils down to the fact that a computer receives input in the form of speech, then the identity of the speech is the output. It's a simulation for human speech perception and processing, and again, it's really complex. It does involve connectionism. There are two aspects to connectionism, though, which are nodes and connections. So nodes are a metaphorical representation of neurons in the brain. Nodes are comprised into three layers: features, which are symbolized as F, phonemes, which are symbolized as P, and words, which are symbolized as W. The feature layer utilizes the input, then the processing carried out in the feature layer is used in the phoneme layer, and finally the information used in the phoneme layer is used in the word layer. It's noteworthy to mention that the output in the words layer can also be used in the phoneme layer. Consider this as a type of feedback loop. And then connections. Connections is a metaphorical representation of the ways in which neurons communicate with each other. There are several studies related to the trace model in your textbook, and they tie in with the cohort model a bit. So make sure to read about that. But the trace model is pretty complex. So these are just sort of the bullet points about that. But yeah, that's all I've got for chapter 3. And I will see you guys next time.